The wrench slipped from my oil-slick fingers at exactly 2:17 a.m., striking the concrete floor of my garage with a sound so sharp it echoed like a gunshot in the quiet. I remember the time because my phone screen was still glowing beside me, unread messages piling up like unanswered questions. I'd been bent over the outboard motor for hours, pretending the mechanical hum and the smell of grease were enough to drown out the truth drifting down from the open bedroom window above my head. That voice, my husband's voice, low, excited, intimate in a way that hadn't belonged to me for months. I froze, one knee on the cold floor, my breath shallow as his laughter floated through the night air, soft, careless, shared with someone who was not his wife. And then I heard her name, the woman I'd only recently learned existed, the woman whose shadow had been quietly stretching across my marriage while I was busy fixing engines and believing lies. "Natalie," he called down suddenly, false concern coating every syllable. "You've been out there forever. Everything okay?" I stood slowly, wiping my hands on a rag already ruined by years of work, and looked up at the silhouette framed in warm yellow light. 12 years of marriage stood at that window. 12 years of shared breakfasts, late-night talks, anniversaries, and promises we once believed were unbreakable. "I'm great," I called back, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me. "Actually, today might be the best day of my life." There was a pause, a heartbeat, a shift in the air. "Why is that?" he asked, laughing nervously. "Because I just found out you got her pregnant," I said. "And my lawyer called 10 minutes ago to confirm every piece of evidence I need to end this marriage." Silence crashed down harder than the wrench ever could. Then came the sound of ceramic shattering against hardwood upstairs, his coffee mug exploding across the bedroom floor. I didn't flinch. I smiled. "My name is Natalie Brooks. I'm 43 years old, a marine engineer in a coastal town that smiles politely while hiding its rot beneath weathered docks and quiet streets. Until 2 weeks ago, I believed my marriage was salvageable. I was wrong. And that night, standing alone in my garage, grease on my hands and truth finally in my chest, I realized something else. I wasn't about to beg. I wasn't about to scream. And I certainly wasn't about to lose. This wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of theirs unraveling. Before everything shattered, before betrayal became a word I tasted daily, my life had been painfully ordinary, and I had loved it for that. I was 43 years old, a marine engineer by trade. Boats made sense to me. Engines failed for reasons you could trace. Damage always had a cause. And if you were patient enough, methodical enough, you could fix almost anything. I liked that clarity. I liked knowing that effort mattered. I grew up in this town, left for a few years in my 20s, chased bigger harbors and better pay, then came back when my father's health started to decline. I bought the small house near the marina because it felt solid, rooted. Like a promise to myself that I wasn't running anymore. That was where I met Evan. He was new in town then, polished in a way that stood out among sunburned fishermen and grease-stained mechanics. He worked in finance, investment consulting, he said, though I never fully understood the details. What I did understand was how easily he talked, how he smiled like he was letting you in on something special. We met at a charity fundraiser at the marina. I was there because someone needed help repairing a donated boat. He was there in a crisp button-down shirt that didn't belong near salt water. We talked for hours that night, about ambition, about wanting more than what we'd grown up with, about how lonely success could be. He made me feel seen. Evan pursued me relentlessly after that. Flowers at my workshop, late-night dinners after long days. He told me he admired my independence, my competence, the way I didn't need anyone to rescue me. When he proposed a year later, kneeling awkwardly in my garage with a ring I knew he'd spent weeks choosing, I said yes without hesitation. Our marriage in the beginning was good. Not cinematic, real. Shared routines, coffee together before work, quiet evenings where we talked about nothing and everything. He moved into my house, and slowly, subtly, the space became ours. The changes came gradually. His hours grew longer. His phone started facing down on tables. Work dinners became overnight trips. He said the pressure was intense, that his career was finally taking off. I believed him because I wanted to, because trusting him felt easier than imagining the alternative. I paid attention to engines, not excuses. His family loved me at first. His mother praised my work ethic, but never missed a chance to mention how hard it must be for Evan to live in such a small town. His sister joked about how I smelled like fuel half the time. I laughed along. I didn't want to be sensitive. I didn't want to be difficult. There were signs I ignored. Hotel receipts tucked into suit jackets. New clothes he wore once and never again. The way he'd shower the moment he came home, like he needed to rinse something off. I told myself it was stress. I told myself successful marriages required trust. I told myself love meant choosing belief over suspicion. What I didn't know, what I couldn't see yet, was that while I was fixing engines and planning anniversaries, Evan was building another life. One where I was convenient, predictable, invisible. The night I overheard him laughing with his friend on the phone, joking about how oblivious I was, I stood frozen in the hallway, my chest tight, my heart beating too loud in my ears. That was the first crack. I didn't confront him then. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I started watching. And once you start really watching, it's impossible to unsee the truth. Once suspicion takes root, it doesn't announce itself loudly. It settles in quietly. Like sand in a gear you didn't know was exposed, grinding softly until something breaks. After that night in the hallway, I started noticing patterns I'd been trained my entire life to recognize. Not emotional ones, mechanical ones. Cause and effect. Evan's behavior wasn't random. It was structured. His phone never left his side anymore, not even in the shower. Notifications were silenced, but his screen lit up constantly. When I asked who was texting so late, he didn't hesitate. Work, he'd say. Always work. He stopped asking about my day. Conversations became logistical. Who was picking up groceries? What time dinner would be? Whether I'd be home late. I felt less like a partner and more like background noise to a life he was clearly more invested in elsewhere. His family shifted too. His mother began calling more often, not to check on me, but to ask if Evan was handling the pressure okay, as if I were an added burden instead of his wife. His sister started making comments about how men like Evan needed stimulation to stay motivated. I didn't like the implication, but I swallowed it. I didn't want to be the paranoid wife. I didn't want to be the woman who imagined problems. But imagination doesn't leave receipts behind. One evening, while doing laundry, I found a hotel bill folded carefully inside his suit jacket. Downtown, weeknight. The same night he'd told me he was staying late at the office. I stood there holding that slip of paper, my fingers trembling, my brain scrambling for explanations that no longer fit. When I asked him about it, he smiled. A calm, patient smile. Client meeting, he said. We needed privacy. Privacy. That word echoed in my head long after he walked away. A few days later, I noticed new cologne. Expensive. Sharp. Not something I'd ever bought him. He wore it lightly, like he didn't want me to notice. But I did. Because I've always noticed details. That's how machines survive the ocean. And then there were the showers. He used to come home exhausted, collapse on the couch, complain about deadlines. Now he went straight to the bathroom, locking the door behind him, steam filling the house as if he were trying to erase something from his skin. I started sleeping lighter, listening, waiting. I replayed our past conversations in my head, searching for the moment I stopped being enough, or if I ever truly was. The final push came at Cassie's bar near the marina. I was there grabbing takeout after a long day when I overheard two men at the counter talking. Evan Brooks, one said. Yeah, the other laughed. Spends a lot of time with that woman from the firm. People notice. They didn't see me standing there. Didn't know they were tearing the last thread of denial out of my hands. That night, I didn't cry. I opened a notebook. I wrote dates, times, patterns. Because if something was breaking, I needed to understand how. And deep down, I already knew. This wasn't stress. This wasn't distance. This was betrayal warming up, stretching its limbs, getting ready to show its face. The moment everything collapsed didn't come with screaming or slammed doors. It arrived quietly, like truth often does, when you're least prepared to survive it. It was 3 nights before the wrench hit the garage floor. I'd come home early that evening, a rare thing for me. The engine I'd been working on all week was finally cooperating, and for the first time in months, I felt light enough to want dinner together. Normal dinner. Plates on the table, no phones, just us. The house was dark when I walked in. Evan's shoes were by the door, but his jacket was gone. I told myself nothing, didn't assume, didn't accuse. I poured myself a glass of water and stood in the kitchen, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the clock, the sound of a life pretending it wasn't about to implode. Then I heard his voice, not on the phone in his hand, but coming from the other room. The speaker was on. I froze. I know, he was saying softly, laughter woven through his words. I just need a little more time. She doesn't suspect anything. My grip tightened around the glass. She trusts me, he continued. She always has. My chest burned. Not like anger, like oxygen being ripped away. A woman laughed on the other end of the line. Warm, intimate, comfortable. And what about the baby? She asked. The glass slipped from my fingers and shattered against the tile. The sound startled him. I heard movement. The call cut off abruptly. When Evan stepped into the kitchen, his face went pale the second he saw me. Water soaked into my boots. Glass glittered across the floor like a cruel decoration. How much did you hear? He asked. Not what he'd said. How much? Enough, I replied. My voice didn't shake. My hands didn't either. That scared him more than yelling ever could have. There was a long pause. Then he exhaled slowly, like a man preparing for negotiation. It's not what you think. I almost laughed. Almost. She's pregnant, I said. Those were her words, not mine. He looked away. That was the moment. The exact second 12 years of marriage officially died. Yes, he admitted quietly, but it wasn't planned. I stared at him. This man I had shared a bed with, trusted with my body, my future. You didn't plan to cheat either, I said. Yet here we are. He reached for me instinctively, as if muscle memory might save him. I stepped back. Don't, I warned. I was going to tell you, he said quickly. Things got complicated. Complicated. As if vows were math problems. As if betrayal had variables. How long? I asked. He hesitated. How long? I repeated, sharper now. 6 months. 6 months. 6 months of lies. 6 months of shared dinners. 6 months of him kissing my forehead and saying he loved me. And the baby? I asked. She's 3 months along. I nodded slowly, absorbing it like a physical blow. So while I was planning our anniversary, I said, you were starting a family with someone else. It doesn't mean I don't love you, he insisted, desperation creeping into his voice. That was when something inside me went completely still. You don't get to say that anymore, I said. Love doesn't coexist with this. He started crying then, actual tears. He talked about pressure, about feeling trapped, about how the woman made him feel admired, desired, powerful. Not once did he say he was sorry. Not really. I walked past him without another word and went to the garage. I sat on the cold floor among tools and half-finished repairs, my back against the wall, my heart beating so hard I thought it might fracture my ribs. I didn't scream, I didn't sob, I breathed. Because somewhere between shattered glass and a confession delivered like a business update, I understood something with terrifying clarity. My marriage hadn't just failed. It had been replaced, and I was the last one to be informed. Shock doesn't feel the way movies teach you to expect it. There was no screaming, no collapse to the floor, no dramatic demand for answers I already had. What I felt instead was a slow, hollow pressure, like the ocean pulling back before a wave you can't outrun. I stayed in the garage that night, not because I was afraid of Evan, but because I needed space to breathe without his explanations filling the air. I sat on an overturned bucket, my back against the workbench, staring at the outlines of tools I'd arranged carefully over the years. Order had always calmed me. Logic, systems, clear cause and effect. But nothing about this followed a system I recognized. My mind replayed the last 6 months in fragments. His hand on my back at the grocery store, the way he'd kissed my temple before leaving for work dinners, the anniversary gift I'd wrapped with care, never knowing he'd already built a future with someone else. I wondered when I'd stopped being a partner and started being an obstacle. That question hurt more than the betrayal itself. Around 4 a.m, the door to the garage creaked open. Evan stood there in sweatpants and a wrinkled t-shirt, eyes red, shoulders slumped. He looked smaller than I remembered, less impressive, like a man stripped of the confidence he'd borrowed from lies. "Nat," he said softly, "please, we need to talk." I didn't look at him. "There's nothing left to clarify," I replied. "You were clear enough." "I made a mistake," he said, "a terrible one, but it doesn't erase what we have." I let out a slow breath. "No," I said calmly. "What you didn't erase our marriage. It exposed it." He stepped closer. I could smell his cologne, the one I now associated with deceit, and it made my stomach turn. "I was scared," he continued. "You're strong, independent. You don't need me. She needed me. She made me feel important," I cut in, finally looking up at him. "So you destroyed 12 years of trust to feel important?" He flinched. I stood up then, my knees stiff, my body heavy but steady. "You didn't cheat because I failed you," I said. "You cheated because you wanted to, because you thought you could get away with it." Silence stretched between us. "I don't know how to fix this," he whispered. "That's because you're not the one who gets to fix it," I replied. For the first time since discovering the truth, tears burned my eyes, not from sadness, but from clarity. I saw our marriage for what it had become, a structure already hollowed out, waiting to collapse. Later that morning, after he finally retreated back into the house, I made 2 phone calls. The first was to a lawyer recommended by a woman who'd rebuilt her life after betrayal. The second was to an old friend in the police department, someone who understood evidence, documentation, and the difference between suspicion and proof. If Evan thought this was going to end with apologies and compromises, he was wrong. I wasn't going to explode. I was going to prepare. And that decision, the quiet resolve forming in my chest, was the moment I stopped being his wife and started becoming myself again. If the truth had been a single blow, I might have recovered faster. But betrayal doesn't stop moving once it's revealed. It spreads. The morning after everything broke open, Evan left the house early. No goodbye, no apology, just the sound of the door closing, like a period at the end of a sentence he didn't want to finish. By noon, his mother had already called. "I heard you and Evan had a disagreement," she said, her tone clipped, practiced. "Marriage is about forgiveness, Natalie. Men make mistakes." Mistakes. I held the phone away from my ear for a moment, breathing through the familiar anger rising in my chest. "This wasn't a mistake," I said evenly. "It was a choice, repeatedly, for 6 months." "Well," she sighed, "you've always been very focused on your work." Maybe he felt neglected. There it was. The quiet shifting of blame. The subtle rewriting of events where I became the reason my husband had built a second life. "I won't be taking responsibility for his infidelity," I replied, "and I won't be discussing my marriage with you again." I hung up before she could respond. By the end of the week, Evan's sister stopped by unannounced. She sat at my kitchen table, legs crossed, eyes sharp. "He says you're being cold," she said, "that you won't even try counseling." Counseling is for couples who want the same future, I answered. We don't. She leaned forward. You know, if you walk away now, people are going to talk. You'll look bitter. I almost smiled. They're already talking, I said. The difference is, I'm done caring. That same afternoon, the evidence started to pile up. My friend from the department showed me photos, time-stamped, clean, undeniable. Evan's car outside her apartment, credit card statements that didn't align with his claimed work trips, messages that painted a picture clearer than any confession. And then there was the pregnancy confirmation. I didn't ask for it. I didn't need to. But when the proof landed in my inbox, my chest tightened anyway. Not with jealousy, with finality. This wasn't an affair that could be untangled. It was a future he'd chosen. Evan tried again that night. He stood in the doorway of the garage, watching me clean my tools with deliberate care. I told her I need space, he said. I'm trying to fix this. I didn't look up. You're trying to minimize damage, I replied, not repair anything. She's not even the point, he insisted. You are. I stopped what I was doing then. Slowly. Carefully. No, I said. I was the point before. Now I'm the consequence. He didn't know what to say to that. Over the next few days, his friends stopped texting me. Invitations disappeared. People I'd known for years avoided eye contact at the marina. The story had already been reshaped in whispers. I was difficult. I was unforgiving. I was cold. And for the first time in my life, I let them believe it. Because beneath the surface, beneath the silence and the judgment, I was changing. Not hardening, sharpening. I wasn't angry anymore. I was focused. And when focus replaces pain, everything becomes dangerous in a very quiet way. The lowest point didn't come with chaos. It came with stillness. One evening, I walked into the house after a 14-hour shift and realized there was nothing left to fight for inside those walls. Evan hadn't come home in days. His closet was half empty. The bed felt too wide, too quiet, like it was already forgetting the shape of us. I stood in the doorway of the bedroom and felt something crack that I hadn't allowed myself to feel yet. Grief. Not for him, but for the version of myself who had believed so completely. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at my hands. These hands had fixed engines in storms, pulled rusted bolts loose with bleeding knuckles, rebuilt things others had given up on. And yet, they'd failed to protect my own heart. That night, the doubts crept in. What if I'd been too distant? What if I'd missed my chance to save it? What if everyone was right and I was just difficult to love? The silence answered none of it. I slept on the couch. Not dramatically, just because the bedroom felt like a museum of broken promises. Around 3 a.m, I woke up gasping, my chest tight, my heart racing for no reason I could name. I pressed my palm against my sternum and waited for the panic to pass. That was when the loneliness hit hardest. Not the absence of a husband, but the realization that I had been emotionally alone long before the affair ever began. The next day I found an old photo tucked inside a drawer. Us on a dock years ago, sunburned and laughing, his arms slung around my shoulders like I was his anchor. I stared at it longer than I should have, then folded it carefully and put it back. I didn't destroy it. I didn't need to. Some things lose their power simply by being seen clearly. That evening, I received a message from Evan. I don't know who I am without you. I read it 3 times before responding. You should have thought about that before you decided you didn't need me. I didn't cry after sending it. What I felt instead was emptiness, a hollow pause between what had been and what hadn't arrived yet. It scared me more than anger ever could. But emptiness, I would later realize, is also space. Space to rebuild. Space to decide. Space to choose myself without apology. That night I made a promise, not to hurt him back, not to prove anything to anyone else, but to never again shrink myself to make someone else feel larger. I didn't know how the story would end yet, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I would not be the woman this broke. The turning point didn't announce itself with confidence. It arrived quietly on a Tuesday morning, wrapped in an email subject line that simply read, "Confirmed." I was at the marina, leaning over an engine block, when my phone buzzed in my pocket. I wiped my hands, glanced at the screen, and felt something inside me settle into place. Not relief, not triumph, finality. My lawyer had finished reviewing everything: the documentation, the timelines, the financial trail Evan hadn't bothered to hide because he'd never imagined I'd look, or worse, understand. I sat down on an overturned crate, the smell of fuel sharp in the air, and read through the message slowly. There would be no surprises, no loopholes, no room for him to spin a story where I was the villain. For the first time since this began, I felt steady. That afternoon, Evan showed up at the marina. He looked tired, older, like someone who'd finally realized the ground beneath him was no longer solid. He stood at a distance, watching me work, waiting to be acknowledged. When I didn't look up, he cleared his throat. "Can we talk?" he asked. I set my wrench down carefully before turning to face him. "We are," I replied. He swallowed. She's pressuring me about the baby, about the future." I studied him, really studied him. This man who once felt like my home. "And?" I asked. "And I don't know what I'm doing," he admitted. "I thought I did, but everything's falling apart." There it was. Not remorse, not accountability, fear. "You made a choice," I said calmly. "Now you're living inside it." He stepped closer. "I never meant to lose you." I shook my head. "You didn't lose me. You traded me. There's a difference." His eyes filled with tears then, and for a brief moment, just a moment, I felt the ghost of the woman I used to be stir inside my chest. The one who would have comforted him, who would have believed his confusion meant something. But that woman was gone. "I've filed," I told him. He froze. "The divorce," I continued. "You'll be served this week." His shoulders slumped. "Is that it?" "Yes," I said. "That's it. No shouting, no accusations, no dramatic goodbye, just truth." That evening, I went home alone and sat in the garage as the sun set behind the docks. I opened my notebook, the one that had started as a place to collect doubts, and closed it for the last time. I didn't need it anymore. I wasn't reacting now. I wasn't surviving. I was choosing. And that choice, quiet, deliberate, irreversible, shifted the balance of power in a way Evan would never fully understand. Because from that moment on, the story wasn't about what he'd done to me. It was about what I would no longer allow. Consequences don't always arrive with noise. Sometimes they unfold quietly, like dominoes tipping one by one, while the person responsible watches, helpless to stop them. Evan was served 3 days later. I wasn't there when it happened. I didn't need to be. The papers were delivered to the apartment he'd been staying in, an address I'd never set foot inside and never would. According to the text he sent me afterward, his hands had been shaking so badly he dropped the envelope twice. "Can we talk before this gets ugly?" he wrote. I didn't reply. By the end of that week, the story had finished making its rounds. In a town like ours, truth moves faster than denial ever could. People connected dots. Timelines stopped adding up. The woman from his office, the one who was pregnant, was suddenly no longer invisible. Whispers turned into facts. Sympathy shifted direction. At the marina, conversations hushed when I walked by, not out of judgment anymore, but respect. Men who'd once avoided eye contact now nodded quietly. Women I barely knew brought me coffee without asking. No one said much. They didn't have to. Evan's world, meanwhile, was shrinking. His job placed him on indefinite leave, pending internal review. The firm didn't want scandal anywhere near their name. Not an affair, not a pregnancy, and certainly not a public divorce layered with lies. His friends stopped inviting him out. His family stopped calling me entirely. And the woman he'd chosen? She started asking questions. Questions he didn't have answers for. Questions about money, about timelines, about why I wasn't fighting harder to keep him. He showed up at the house once, stood at the end of the driveway like a stranger, unsure if he was allowed to approach. I didn't open the door. I watched from the kitchen window as he finally turned away, shoulders slumped, car pulling off slowly, like he was hoping I'd change my mind. I didn't. The divorce moved quickly. There wasn't much to argue over. No children, separate finances, a clean split that reflected the reality of what we'd become. Two people walking in opposite directions long before the paperwork caught up. The day it was finalized, I sat alone in my garage and felt calm. No victory, no satisfaction, just release. Evan lost things he'd assumed were permanent. My trust, his reputation, the illusion that choices didn't carry weight. None of it happened because I exposed him or punished him. It happened because truth, once uncovered, has a way of doing the work for you. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't chase revenge. I didn't try to win. I simply stopped protecting him. And that, more than anything else, was what made the fallout irreversible. The morning after the divorce was finalized, I woke up before sunrise. Not because I couldn't sleep, but because I didn't need to hide from the day anymore. The house was quiet in a different way now. Not hollow, not heavy, just open. I made coffee, stood by the window, and watched the marina come to life. Boats rocking gently against their slips, gulls calling out over the water. Ordinary sounds that had once been drowned out by the noise in my head. For the first time in a long time, my thoughts were my own. I didn't feel like a woman who'd lost something. I felt like someone who'd finally put down a weight she didn't realize she'd been carrying alone. I kept my routine, went to work, fixed engines, took on a bigger contract that would have intimidated me months ago. People treated me differently, not with pity, but with quiet acknowledgement. Like they understood something had changed, even if they couldn't name it. And Evan? He became a footnote. Occasionally, I'd hear updates through mutual acquaintances. He'd moved again. The job situation was unstable. The future he'd rushed toward had become complicated in ways he hadn't planned for. I didn't take satisfaction in it, but I didn't shield him from it either. That chapter was closed. What I learned, what I wish someone had told me years earlier, is this. Love isn't proven by endurance. Loyalty isn't measured by how much you tolerate. And strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes, strength is the quiet decision to stop explaining yourself to people who benefit from misunderstanding you. If you're listening to this and you're standing where I once stood, wondering if you're asking for too much, if you're being too cold, too independent, too hard to love, listen carefully. The right person will never require you to disappear so they can feel important. You don't need revenge. You don't need validation. You don't need to be louder. You just need to choose yourself once and mean it. I did, and that choice rebuilt everything.